is Peter Helland on the show Israel. I've called this the Declaration of Independence, and I've touched on this many times, but it's a subject worthwhile going into. That's talking about our Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July. Abigail Adams wrote a letter to John Adams before the Declaration of Independence, and she brought to light what was kind of going on behind the scenes. And she said, I long to hear that you have declared an independency. This is March 31st, so in about 2 or 3 months, they finally did declare it on 4th of July. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute. But such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. Why then not put it out of the power of the vicious and the lawless to use us with cruelty and indignity with impunity? Men of sense of all ages abhor those customs which treat us only as the vassals of your sex. Regard us then as beings placed by providence under your protection, and in imitation of the Supreme Being, make use of that power only for our happiness. Now, her request was granted through the years. Took a while for that request. Adams rejected her appeal, and he said, you already have that. You already have it. All we have is the title of master with no substance, and we're not going to give that up. Well, they gave that up in the Civil War, because the word master was associated with slavery and it was abhorrent to people. So up to the Civil War, the women did call their husbands master or lord. Even Lincoln's wife did. But after the Civil War, that word became a bad word. And the Declaration of Independence was what the radical Republicans and Lincoln were going back to get right to the issue. The head of the radical Republicans was Alexander Stevens. And he said in 1866, he writes, he's from Pennsylvania, in my youth, a congressman, in my youth, in my manhood, in my old age, I have fondly dreamed that when any future fortunate circumstances should have broken up for a while the foundations of our institutions and released us from foundations the most tyrannical that ever man imposed in the name of freedom, that the intelligent, pure, and just men of this republic, true to their professions and conscience, would have so remodeled all our institutions as to have freed us from every vestige of human oppression, of inequality of rights, of the recognized degradation of the poor and the superior caste of the rich. In short, that no distinction should be tolerated in this purified republic but what arose from merit and conduct. This bright dream has vanished like the baseless fabric of our vision. I find that we shall be obliged to be content with patching up the worst portions of the ancient edifice and leaving it in many of its parts to be swept away by tempest, the frost, and the storms of despotism. Now, this book is by Gregg. He's a kind of a well-known theologian and historian from the South, a Presbyterian. He writes, his radicalism led Stevens to regard the writing and the adoption of the Constitution as the most terrible kind of tyranny ever imposed on mankind in the name of freedom. And then he, later on, he says, there have been republics everywhere in the midst of despotism. You may call what you choose a republic, but what I am to speak to now is the republic intended by the Declaration of Independence, and I deny that this government has ever been such a republic. Now, what was the republic contemplated by the Declaration of Independence? All men are created free and equal, and all rightful government is based on the consent of the governed. Nothing short of that is the republic intended by the Declaration. Upon this declaration alone stood the American Revolution. And the people then had no actual grievance which justified the shedding of one drop of human blood. So the whole idea of taxation without representation, even Stevens is saying there's nothing to that. But he says this, but they fought and bled for this sublime idea. In other words, there was no justification for the revolution. Oh, we're not being taxed right. He's saying the people then had no actual grievance which justified the shedding of one drop of human blood. They fought for an idea. In this sign, in this idea, they conquered. But when peace and security had come and the several sovereignties attempted to form a more perfect union, they found themselves obstructed by a pernicious and unyielding institution in direct hostility to their avowed principles, and they were obliged to trust to time to eradicate it. They have left the scene of action. If we fail to complete this superstructure in harmony with the foundation, we must be dwarfs in intellect or moral courage. Now, obviously, that institution was slavery. And they're saying slavery was so inconsistent with the Declaration of Independence it wasn't funny. But in order to form the Union, they had to agree with the South. And the South was really stupid to form that agreement because it was inevitable that they were going to be crushed. And some people saw that, but they didn't listen. Now, the person that addressed that was the theologian. Stevens is a politician. The theologian that addressed that was John Henry Hopkins, who was the Bishop of Vermont. He was from Ireland, Bishop of Vermont, who after the Civil War became the head bishop of the Episcopal Church, which was the Church of England, which was the Church of George Washington, which was the dominant church, the Anglican Church. And Hopkins was asked before the Civil War, 1860, to write the correct biblical view of slavery. They considered him the best divine. They went to him. And the attack against slavery, a lot of people think, is because the Bible condemns slavery. Well, the South won every one of those debates. Like I've said before, the chaplain at Harvard, Peter Gomes, a black homosexual, this is many years ago, I think when Mayor Pete Buttigieg was there, Peter Gomes mocked the idea that the Bible condemns slavery. But everybody's had a gun to their head saying, you better believe that the Bible condemns slavery. But slavery was overthrown not because the Bible overthrew it. It was overthrown because the Declaration of Independence was against it. That's what Stevens is saying. The Declaration of Independence was totally against that institution, and the Civil War was fought to complete what the Declaration of Independence said. All men are created equal, which meant the women should have a right to vote, and the blacks should have a right to vote, and they should have equal representation in government. And right after the Civil War, the movement to get the women the right to vote was very strong. It failed. It took another 60 years before it came to pass. But they were trying to get, Stevens said, we fought this war to get everything in harmony with those fundamental principles of the Declaration of Independence. And Gregory Singer says, yeah, he's right. The Constitution was at odds to the Declaration of Independence. Stevens says the Constitution was the greatest piece of tyranny the world's ever seen against freedom, because his idea of freedom was the Declaration of Independence. And they say Stevens was a Baptist. I remember reading he was a total infidel and had a hard time figuring out. He was kind of always hiding what he really believed. But he did, supposedly, he's accused of always having a mistress. He wasn't married, but he had this helper with him all the time. And, Thomas Jefferson. It's not unusual that they're cheating sexually, and they're the biggest promoters of this radical notion of freedom. But here's what Hopkins says. This was his 50-page, 40-page book that he responded to the men in New York. what's the biblical position on slavery, which then in 1864 he wrote an almost 400-page book to back up his position. But he says this, I have promised to notice the various objections which have been raised in the popular mind to the institution of Southern slavery, and to these I shall now proceed. First on this list stand the propositions of the far-famed Declaration of Independence. Quote, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Hopkins writes, these statements are here called self-evident truths, but with respect to the celebrated names which are appended to this document, I have never been able to comprehend that they are truths at all. In what respect are men created equal? When every thoughtful person must be sensible that they are brought into the world with all imaginable difference in body, in mind, and in every characteristic of their social position. Notwithstanding, mankind have all descended from one common parent, yet we see them divided into distinct races, so strongly marked that infidel philosophers insist on the impossibility of their having the same ancestry. Where is the equality in body between the child born with the hereditary taint of scrofula or consumption and the infant filled with health and vigor? Where is the equality in mind between one who is endowed with talent and genius and another whose intellect borders on idiocy? Where is the equality in social position between the son of the Esquimaux or Hottentot and the heir of the American statesman or British peer? Neither am I able to admit that all men are endowed with the inalienable right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, because it is manifest that, quote, since sin entered into the world and death by sin, that's St. Paul, they are all alienated, forfeited, and lost through the consequences of transgression. Life is alienated not only by the sentence of the law, but by innumerable forms of violence and accident. Liberty is alienated not only by imprisonment, but by the irresistible restraints of social bondage to the will, the temper, the prejudices, the customs, or the interest of others, so that there is hardly an individual to be found, even in the most favored community, who has really the liberty of word and action so confidently asserted as the inalienable right of all men. Don't forget, it was Thomas Paine. A lot of people say Thomas Paine wrote the Declaration of Independence, but he went on to write The Rights of Man, trying to wipe out Christianity. And Stevens used that Declaration of Independence to go after Christianity, because that was what the spirit of it was. And then Hopkins writes, and as regards the pursuit of happiness, alas, what multitudes alienate their right to it beyond recovery, not only in the cells of the penitentiary, but in the reckless indulgence of their appetites and passions, in the disgust arising from ill-chosen conjugal relations. In other words, you go ahead and have sex with somebody, and then you're disgusted about what you just did, of course. And in their associations with the profligate and the vile, in the pain and suffering of sickness and poverty as the result of vice, in the ruin of the gambler, the delirium of the drunkard, the despair of the suicide, and in every other form of moral contamination. If it be said, however, that the equality and inalienable rights of all men are so strongly asserted by this famous declaration, are only to be taken in a political sense, I am willing to concede that this may be the proper interpretation of its intended meaning, but I cannot see how it removes the difficulty. The statement is that all men are created equal and that their Creator has endowed them with these inalienable rights. See, Hopkins knew this was the issue of the war. This was the issue of the conflict. These truths were being pressed on the North. And they have the rebel song in the South. There's a song that the Southerners used to sing. And one line goes, and I hate the Declaration of Independence. That's what the Southerners used to sing. They understood that they were at war with that declaration, which put them in a conflict, because they themselves came into existence through that Declaration of Independence. And the Southerners never threw it off. They held on to it because the Declaration of Independence was a deist document. It was not Christian. I mean, Hopkins goes into it. Singer goes into it. The Declaration of Independence was not a Christian document at all. All 13 colonies, most all states in the United States acknowledge God. But the God that they acknowledge is not the God of Jesus Christ. Because the God of Jesus Christ can only be known and approached through Jesus Christ. So if you don't acknowledge Jesus Christ, you don't have the God of Jesus Christ. And if you don't have the God of Jesus Christ, you don't have the true God. So all these states acknowledging God, that's a deist God. That's the God of Thomas Paine. That's the God of Voltaire, Robespierre, all the infidels of the French Revolution. Thomas Jefferson, a tremendous infidel. Gregg Singer says Thomas Jefferson was second to Ethan Allen, who was an all-out atheist. That's why Vermont is the state of witches. It's got witches in that state because its founder was Ethan Allen, an all-out atheist. And Singer says Thomas Jefferson was next in the level of rebellion to Christ. And the South held on to that. And so, they had a movement to acknowledge Christ in their new Constitution, which was really the original Constitution, most of it. But that movement failed, and you have to make a break. You're going to either acknowledge Jesus Christ or not. And to think you're acknowledging God, it wasn't going to do it. Okay, the statement is that all men are created equal, and that the Creator has endowed them with these inalienable rights. Certainly, if the authors of this celebrated document designed to speak only of political rights and political equality, they should not have thus referred them to the act of creation. Hopkins was very brilliant, because it is perfectly obvious that since the beginning of human government, men have been created with all imaginable inequality, under slavery, under despotism, under aristocracy, under limited monarchy, under every imaginable form of political strife and political oppression. In no respect whatever that I can discover has the Almighty sent our race into the world with these imaginary rights and this fanciful equality. Of course, this is what we're forced to believe. Our whole legal structure, our whole government is founded on these principles of the Declaration of Independence. In fact, every court decision goes through analyzes, I hope we're not in violation of the Declaration of Independence, which has no legal authority. In his sight, the whole world is sinful, rebellious, and lying under the just condemnation of his violated laws. Our original rights, whatever they might have been, are all forfeited and gone because of the fall. And since the fall, mankind have no rights to claim at the hands of the Creator. Our whole dependence is on his mercy and compassion. And he dispenses these according to his sovereign will and pleasure. And no system of equality that any human eye can discover, and yet, as every Christian must believe, on the eternal principles of perfect benevolence in union with impartial justice and boundless knowledge and wisdom that cannot err. Where then, I ask, did the authors of the Declaration of Independence find their warrant for such a statement? It was probably judicious enough to call these propositions self-evident truths because it seems manifest that no man can prove them. Now, the Declaration of Independence came on the 4th of July. Now, when I came into the world, I had a sister ahead of me, 18 months ahead of me. And she was born on the 4th of July. So for me, and that's when people, like in my family, my mom was really into celebrating birthdays, which Christians really are not supposed to celebrate. If you have any connection to the historical church, the early Christians uniformly understood that the celebration of a birthday was a pagan concept. The Bible talks about the day of conception, when somebody was conceived. But celebration of birthdays was seen as pagan. But where are we at? Every church goes really hog wild on birthdays, okay? And you go, hold it here. What's your connection to the early church on that one? But my sister was born on the 4th, so that was a huge thing. And it just so happened my sister was the queen, and that's really what the fourth has done. It's elevated the woman to a queen position. And even Jefferson Davis dedicated his last 2 volumes to the women of the South. The well-known theologian Horace Bushnell, he says the reason that the South rebelled and seceded because they were listening to the women. That's what he said. They were listening to the women. You could read stories about the women making fun of their person they're engaged to, making fun of them. No, I'm not going to marry you. If you don't fight that war, I'm not going to marry you. They were urging them into it. So you have Adam's sin, which was he hearkened unto the voice of his wife. And was it really her voice? No, it was the serpent had conquered the woman, and he was obeying the serpent. You shall be as gods. Oh, yeah. And then you have the other. There's only 2 main lessons there in the beginning of the Bible. And if you learn these 2 lessons, you're well on the way of staying on the straight and narrow. The other lesson is Cain. Cain kills Abel, and God says, "What?" And Cain tells God, "Well, am I my brother's keeper?" Yeah, you are your brother's keeper. So the first commandment is to love God. Adam failed to love God by obeying him and listening to his voice. He went to the woman instead. Cain is the second commandment. Jesus said there's 2 commandments, love God and love your neighbor. Cain refused to be his brother's keeper. Now, we're to learn this. We must obey the second commandment to love your neighbor. We are our brother's keeper. Do you want to challenge that? You want to go the way of Cain? Cain disappears from the Bible. He was marked and he's gone. He was the inheritor. He was the oldest son, the first child of Adam and Eve. He lost it. Cain gets kicked out. It says he got very angry. And God said to Cain, "Why are you so angry? Why is your countenance fallen down? Sin is crouching at the door. You better master it." He allowed the anger. That anger kicked him out of the garden. Moses gets angry. He's not allowed in to the promised land. So anger did him in. And where did that anger come from? Looks like it originated because Cain was not really right with God. He was not really loving God. He was holding back on the sacrifice, on his offering. We can't do that. We have to love God totally. And we have to be our brother's keeper. If you walk outside of that narrow path, you get off that road, you're going to have trouble. And the reason we bring this up is the Declaration of Independence, in a sense, wants to say, that's the voice of the woman. You can be free from the law of God. There's a way, in America, you can be free from that. You don't have to be your brother's keeper. You're an individual. Just go for the money. Go for your own. And the law of God, we have our own set of laws. You want to commit adultery? Not against the law here. You want to marry a guy? That's perfectly fine here. Yeah, independence. So he writes, it was probably judicious enough to call these propositions self-evident truths because it seems manifest that no man can prove them. He's pointing out that the Declaration of Independence was just a complete lie. He goes on and explains that we're simply not equal. And he goes through all the animal natures of things. And he says, this brief and most inadequate sketch of the order of creation may serve at least to show that the manifest inequality in the condition of mankind is no exception to the rule, but is sustained by all analogy. It is the will of God that it should be so, and no human sagacity or effort can prevent it. And the same principle exists in our political relations. We may talk as we please of our equality and political rights and privileges, But in point of fact, there is no such thing. Amongst the other civilized nations, it is not even pretended. None of the great galaxy of European governments can have a better title to it than England. Yet who would be so absurd as to claim political equality in a land of monarchy, of hereditary nobles or time-honored aristocracy? But then he goes on, he says, really, are you guys really equal? He says, you're not equal. He says, who formed the party to which the candidate belongs? Who ruled the convention by which his name was put upon the list? Who arranged the orators for the occasion? Who subsidized the press? And now we would say, who counts the votes? Who put the voting machine in? You think it's equality? Or do you think there's people that have more power than you that are controlling who gets into power? Well, it's obvious. It's obvious that we don't have control over this. Can any human power ever manufacture a candidate out of him? The notion would be preposterous. Where then is his political equality? Even here in our happy land of universal suffrage, how does it appear that all men are born equal? The proposition is a sheer absurdity. All men are born unequal in body and mind and social privileges. Their intellectual faculties are unequal. Their education is unequal. Their associations are unequal. Their opportunities are unequal. And their freedom is as unreal as their equality. The poor are compelled to serve the rich, and the rich are compelled to serve the poor by paying for their services. The political party is compelled to serve the leaders, and the leaders are compelled to scheme and toil in order to serve the party. The multitude are dependent on the few who are endowed with talents to govern, and the few are dependent on the multitude for the power, without which all government is impossible. From the top to the bottom of the social fabric, the whole is thus seen to be inequality and mutual dependence. So he goes on. Well, yeah, okay. And hence, although they are free from the special kind of slavery which the southern states maintain over the posterity of Ham, that's how they talked. Africa then was called the land of Ham, and it was assumed that the blacks were the posterity of Ham, and I'm not going to go into that discussion. Yet they are all, from the highest to the lowest, in bondage quite as real, from which they cannot escape, the slavery of circumstances, called in the ordinary language of the world necessity. You're under the slavery of circumstances and necessity. I have been, I fear, unreasonably tedious in thus endeavoring to show why I utterly discard these famous propositions of the Declaration of Independence. Now, why is the Declaration of Independence, is it still holding power over us today? You have the well-known attorney and his wife, Ted Olson, his wife was on the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania where they said, let's roll on 9/11. His wife was on that plane. This is Ted Olson. He was a conservative Republican. He took the case to the Supreme Court that enabled same-sex marriage. And he said it was the greatest achievement of his life. And he used the Gettysburg Address and the Declaration of Independence as the fulcrum for his argument. Those two documents don't have any legal standing. They have emotional standing. So these decisions are based on emotion. There's nothing manly about it at all. I have been, I fear, unreasonably tedious in thus endeavoring to show why I utterly discard these famous propositions of the Declaration of Independence. It is because I am aware of the strong hold which they have gained over the ordinary mind of the nation. They are assumed by thousands upon thousands as if they were the very doctrines of divine truth. And they are made the basis of the hostile feeling against the slavery of the South, notwithstanding their total want of rationality. Yet I do not wonder that such maxims should be popular. They are admirably calculated to gratify the pride and ambition so natural to the human heart, and are therefore powerful incentives in the work of political revolution. Do your study on Lincoln and Karl Marx, Lincoln and the Marxist. Marx says, now the revolution can begin. Lincoln and Vladimir Lenin go together. It was meant that this was to be a revolutionary. 1776, Gordon S. Wood said it was radically revolutionary. In fact, he said it was very revolutionary based on how the family was going to be run. And Abigail Adams fits right in. It's like the nuclear bomb. You know, you got the atom. And if you can if you can play with the neutrons and the protons and the electrons and the atom, you can create an explosion that'll wipe out the world. You play with what Abigail Adams was saying, you are not going to be our master, John. We're going to be friends. And you're there to help us be happy. Well, they won. They won. The women now are ruling the homes. And if they don't feel you're making them happy, they're going to divorce you, take you to court. Ask the men. Ask the men. You go into that courtroom, they find out who's in charge of that marriage. The woman's in charge. Now you're going, well, that's an exaggeration. Well, talk to them. Talk to the men, what they go through. But the men supported this revolution. The people in the North fought for the North to defeat the South and to impose the Declaration of Independence over the Constitution. And the 14th Amendment turned that Constitution right to the Declaration of Independence. Those principles instead. They're admirably calculated, these propositions in the Declaration of Independence, to gratify the pride and ambition so natural to the human heart, and are therefore powerful incentives in the work of political revolution. It was for this purpose, I presume, that they were introduced in that famous document, which publicly cast off the allegiance of the colonies to the British Crown. And the same doctrines were proclaimed a few years later in a similar service by the French Directory, in the midst of a far more terrible revolution. Liberty, equality, and fraternity, the rights of man, were then the watchwords of the excited populace, while their insane leaders published the decree of atheism, and a notorious courtesan, prostitute, was enthroned as the goddess of reason in the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And the guillotine daily massacred the victims of democratic fury till the streets of Paris ran with blood. I do not state this fact because I desire to place the revolutions in the colonies and in France on the same foundation with respect to the spirit or the mode in which they were conducted. God forbid that I should forget the marked features of contrast between them. On the one side, there was religious reverence, strong piety, and pure disinterested patriotism. On the other, there was the madness of atheism, the brutality of ruffianism, and the reign of terror to all that was good and true. In no one mark or character, indeed, could I deem that there was any comparisons between them, save in this, that the same false assumption of human equality and human rights was adopted in both. Yet how widely different was their result on the question of Negro slavery. The American Revolution produced no effect whatever on that institution, while the French Revolution roused the slaves of their colony in Saint Domingo, Haiti, to a general insurrection, and a scene of barbarous and cruel butchery succeeded, to which the history of the world contains no parallel. I've had Gus Zilke on the show, and his ancestors that he's directly related to, the plantation owner from France, was murdered, and his children snuck out, and they knocked on the door of Mother Seton, made it out. But they wiped them out in the name of these principles. And now why that didn't happen here? They had enough Christianity, they had a different situation. But the Civil War is absolutely called by most scholars the Second French Revolution. And then the war began. This brings me to the last remarks which I have to present on this famous declaration. And I respectfully ask my readers to consider them maturely. So I would pay attention to them. You're saying, well, that's 1860. Well, we're run by the Declaration. They won the war. This is before the war. Lincoln won the war. The Gettysburg Address is everything. We had to memorize that. Everybody had to memorize the Gettysburg Address. They used to have to memorize Washington's farewell address. They don't do it anymore because Washington said morality and religion are essential for a republic. They don't want you to know that. So he writes, First then, it seems manifest that when the signers of this document assumed that all men were born equal, they did not take the Negro race into account at all. This is where people are really upset. It is unquestionable that the author, Mr. Jefferson, was a slaveholder at the time and continued so to his life's end. It is certain that the great majority of the other signers of the Declaration were slaveholders likewise. No one can be ignorant of the fact that slavery had been introduced into all the colonies long before and continued to exist long after in every state save one. Surely then it cannot be presumed that these able and sagacious men intended to stultify themselves by declaring that the Negro race had rights, which nevertheless they were not ready to give them. Well, how about giving the women the right to vote? So it's not just the blacks, also the women. And yet it is evident that we must either impute this crying injustice to our revolutionary patriots or suppose that the case of the slaves was not contemplated. So they would not give any rights to the women. It was abhorrent to them. And they wouldn't give any rights to the blacks as far as right to vote and all that. And then he goes on and says it's also in the preamble of the United States. We, the people of the United States, did not include the blacks, and it seems to me did not include the women. Now, it is the established maxim of the law that every written document must be understood according to the true intent of the parties when it was executed. He goes on to that principle. In the second place, however, it should be remembered that the Declaration of Independence, whether true or false, whether it be interpreted legally or illegally, forms no part of our present system. As a great historical document, it stands and must ever stand prominent before the nations of the world. But it was put forth more than 7 years anterior to the Constitution. Its language was not adopted in that Constitution, and it has no place whatever in the obligatory law of the United States. When our orators, our preachers, and our politicians, therefore, take its propositions about human rights and human equality and set them up as the supreme law, overruling the Constitution and the acts of Congress, which are the real law of the land, I cannot wonder enough at the absurdity of the proceeding, and I doubt whether the annals of civilized mankind can furnish a stronger instance of unmitigated perversity. Well, now we have the courts going by the Declaration of Independence. They don't have any standing. That's just the Declaration of Independence. That was just a piece of total propaganda. So now we got a piece of total propaganda with just lies. Even the courts are standing on that. How'd they get away with it? Thirdly and lastly, I am utterly opposed to those popular propositions, not only because I hold them to be altogether fallacious and untrue, for the reasons already given, but further because their tendency, which is what this country is driven by, is in direct contrariety to the precepts of the gospel and the highest interests of the individual man. So in other words, why would I go into this? Well, there's a lady here in town. I've known her for many, many years. And she told me a while back that her granddaughter woke up at age 17. She was being homeschooled by her son. And announced to the family that she was a guy. Took off her breast, did all the, to make her voice like a man, did all that they're doing. So and her son was a minister. He was homeschooling his daughter. He stayed home, the wife worked, and the daughter does this. And then she became a Muslim. Now, she just told me, because I see her periodically, I asked, how's your granddaughter doing? She just told me that the granddaughter said, she gave up on it. It doesn't work. Now, she was militant about it. You couldn't talk to her. She was militant. Now she's just going, it didn't work. Well, she had no breast, and she did all kinds of other stuff. So I'm talking to the lady. I said, now, hold it here. How could that have happened? Well, they said because she was homeschooled, she picked it up off the internet. I'm thinking it's got to be something more than that. No. This has an effect, okay? When you're operating on these principles, which are very anti-Christian, that's what Singer points out, that's what Hopkins points out, these principles of the Declaration of Independence, which are guiding the country, which our legal system is founded on, is overturning Christianity. So this child, her dad is the keeper at home, and the mom is out of the home working. Now, you're going to tell me that has no influence on that child? This is happening at every stage. So is it any wonder these kids have lost their way. And they're just, whoosh. The guy says, I'm a girl. The girl says, I'm a guy. There's reasons for this. And it's going back to these anti-Christian principles that are directing everything. Why is why is the man the keeper at home? He's not to be the keeper at home. The wife is commanded to be a keeper at home. And that's why I brought this book here, Domestical Duties. It goes into detail after detail on the role of the woman, the role of the husband, and how it has to be kept, how the woman must address the husband as master. Must have the veil on, or you're going to reap a whirlwind. And we are reaping a whirlwind because we're operating on these principles of the Declaration of Independence and not on the biblical principles. So he goes, what is the unavoidable effect of this doctrine of human equality? Is it not to nourish the spirit of pride, envy, and contention? To set the servant against the master, the poor against the rich, the weak against the strong, the ignorant against the educated, to loosen all the bonds and relations of society, to reduce the whole duty of subordination to the selfish cupidity of pecuniary interest, talking about money, without an atom of respect for age, for office, for law, for government, for providence, or for the Word of God. Why is it that all the teachers that have been teaching for over 40 years will tell you every year the students got worse. Every year they got worse. Well, how long can you go where every year the younger people get worse? I'm talking about moral character, behavior, everything. They're worse. We don't want to get to the root of it. I do not deny, indeed, that this doctrine of equality is a doctrine of immense power to urge men forward in a constant struggle for advancement. Its natural operation is to force the vast majority into a ceaseless contest with their circumstances, each discontented with his lot, so long as he sees anyone else above him and toiling with unceasing effort to rise upon the social scale of wealth and importance as fast and as far as he can. There is no principle of stronger impulse to stimulate ambition in every department. And hence arises its manifold influence on the business, the enterprise, the commerce, the manufacturers, the agriculture, the amusements, the fashions, and the political strifes of our northern people, making them all restless, all aspiring, and all determined, if possible, to pass their rivals in the race of selfish emulation. Does this sound like, yes, I'm my brother's keeper? No, this sounds like, I ain't my brother's keeper. I'm going for the gusto. But how does it operate on the order, the stability, and the ultimate prosperity of the nation? How does it work on the steadfast administration of justice, the honor and purity of our public officers, the quiet subordination of the various classes in the community, the fidelity and submission of domestics, the obedience of children, and the relations of family and home? Lincoln said to Gettysburg Address, we are dedicated to the proposition all men are created equal. You are on the altar of that. You're being sacrificed for that. That's our ideology, and that's what you must bow to. That's what you must serve, and you must bow to, and you go to wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, all over the world. You go to World War I. Not only was it just the Civil War that was fighting for this radical equality, World War I was fought for democracy, which is equality. World War II, we were helping Joe Stalin, which is radical. Communism is radical equality. Everything you do is at the service of this false god. You join the military, you work for the government, that's what you're working for. Totally against Christianity. But how does it operate on the order, the stability, and the ultimate prosperity of the nation? How does it work on the steadfast administration of justice, the honor and purity of our public officers? Okay? Above all, how does it harmonize with the great doctrines of the Bible? That the Almighty Ruler appoints to every man his lot on earth and commands him to be satisfied and thankful for his portion. That we must submit ourselves to those who have the rule over us. That we should obey the laws and honor the magistrates. That the powers that be are ordained of God. And he that resists the power shall receive condemnation, that we may not covet the property of others. that having food and raiment, we should be therewith content, that we must avoid strife, contention, and railing accusations, and follow peace, charity, and goodwill, remembering that the service of Christ is the only perfect freedom, and that our true happiness depends not on the measure of our earthly wealth, on social equality, on honor, or on our relative position in the community, but on the fulfillment of our personal duty according to our lot in reliance on His blessing. He says, I have no more to add with respect to this most popular dogma of human equality, and shall therefore dismiss it as fallacious in itself and only mischievous in its tendency, as it is the stronghold of the ultra-abolitionist. I have devoted a large space to its examination and trust that the conclusion is sufficiently plain. Happily, it forms no part of our Constitution or our laws. The Supreme Court's using it. It never was intended to apply to the question of Negro slavery, and it never can be so applied without a total perversion of its historical meaning, and an absolute contrariety to all the facts of humanity and the clear instruction of the Word of God. So Hopkins, who was probably next to Robert Louis Dabney, the two greatest theologians, Dabney said the same thing about the Declaration of Independence. Now Singer closes his book here in his conclusion. Now, Singer destroyed Locke. He said he agreed with Dabney that Locke was a baptized atheist. Locke snuck these ideas in that all authority comes from the consent of the governed. Even to the point that the king his authority came from the consent of the governed, but God gets his authority from the consent of the governed. And the evangelical movement after the Civil War, which followed C.I. Scofield, the whole theme of C.I. Scofield is that Christ came to set up His kingdom, and He was rejected. And people swallowed that. And we're in the interregnum right now, okay? Jesus is not Christ right now under Scofield's teaching, which all evangelicals have soaked that in. Bethel College, their textbook, yes. Jesus is not Christ right now. Well, if Jesus is not Christ right now, and you believe that, you're only born again by believing He is the Christ sitting on the throne of David now. No, they deny He is. And why? How did Scofield get away with this after the Civil War? Because it became entrenched with the Declaration of Independence that authority comes from the consent of the governed, and even God has no authority in this nation except by our consent. So Jesus came to set up His kingdom, and they didn't consent, period. The Jews did not consent, and that's why He couldn't set it up. That's the teaching that the Christians have swallowed because it made sense to them. Obviously, nobody has authority without the consent of the people. Well, the voice of the people is almost next to the devil. You read the Old Testament, Saul went by the voice of the people, and then he went to the witch of Endor. Very similar. What was Eve's voice? It was the voice of the serpent. And you're going to form your truth on the voice of the majority? That's going to be the basis of your authority and truth. You can't get. And then commerce and money is the basis of everything. So the love of money is the root of all evil. And now you're going by the voice of what? The majority? The voice of the people is another word for the voice of the serpent? What's going on here? What can we expect from this? And nobody wants to talk about it. So Singer closes his book here. Does orthodoxy have a satisfactory answer? Orthodoxy means really true Christianity. Does it have an answer to the dilemma which this nation faces? This is 1964. Basically, these problems are the same. 1770, it's the same dynamic. This is an important question and demands an answer. If liberalism has been such an influential agency for the creation of a movement away from constitutional government and the traditional American freedom toward a collectivist society and some kind of totalitarian regime, does Christian orthodoxy have a remedy for this situation? A thorough discussion of this question actually demands a volume in itself, but a short presentation is necessary as a capstone for this volume. So here's the answer, right here. He writes, the answer is found in the biblical view of government. The scriptures clearly teach that human government is of divine ordination and does not have its origin in any social compact or contract as Hobbes and Locke taught, nor was it created by man himself to meet the needs of his society. Rather, does Christian theism insist that government was ordained of God for man, and that its just powers come from God and not from man. Government is not ordained primarily to defend human liberty, but to ensure that kind of society necessary for man to carry out those duties which he owes to God alone. So government exists for the purpose of virtue, man trying to do God's will. And government is there to help man do his will, and when he walks out of doing God's will, government's there to correct him. Reward those who do good and punish those who do evil. And evil is anything outside of the Word of God, outside of God's commandment. Thus, government has clearly defined powers and operates in a clearly defined sphere. Well, we've lost all that. We're totally lost. The basic error of liberalism at this point has been its insistence that human government is a social institution responsible to those men who created it, and is primarily concerned with the preservation of human rights as they were defined by Jefferson and others of that day. This error is very popular among Christian people as well as the nation at large, and it has been productive of great error, for it has allowed the forces of political liberalism to extend the operations of government into those spheres where it has no right to be. And in so doing, it has actually become a menace to the human liberty which the liberals insist that it must protect. In other words, if you spare the rod, you hate your child. But he that loves his child is diligent to discipline him. Well, go ahead and discipline your child. And watch a neighbor call Child Protective Services. And then they'll be hounding you forever and ever. Yeah. So now that child does not get the rod. He that spares the rod hates the child. Beat your child and you'll deliver him from hell. Try to operate on that. Tell the courts that's what you're operating on. See what they say. Now with Biden, they're putting super liberal judges all over. See what they think about that. It is this extension of power into these forbidden areas which has created the modern totalitarian state. When human government enters into the field of labor relations, education, mental and physical health, agriculture, housing, and those many other areas of legislation so characteristic of the federal government today, it leaves its proper functions and enters into those areas of life which God has either ordained that the church or the family should have as their particular sphere of responsibility, or that they should be the concern of some human institution which man may erect for his own civil purposes under God's common grace. Now, the public school is the biggest problem, because the government is not, the children are ordained by God to be raised by the parents and educated by the parents. And to relegate it to the government, I think is absolutely wrong. Can a husband just relegate his authority to his wife? He thinks he can. Can you relegate your education to the public school? He thinks he can. Well, I'm going to relegate it to the church, to the Christian school. Does God ordain that the church educate your children? Does he ordain that the state, the government, educate your children? No, he's ordained the father. The father is to put the word of God into that child day in and day out. When you rise up, when you sit down, he's to do it. So basically, no father should allow his daughter or son to marry somebody that's not going to raise the children in the instruction and admonition of the Lord. The woman has to be a keeper at home, and their job is to put the word of God, give a skill to the son, guard the daughter's chastity, and put the word of God into their son day in and day out. You should never allow your children to marry somebody that's not going to do that, or you suspect can't do that. Why are these fathers? That was Ezra and Nehemiah. They got furious at the fathers for allowing this to happen to their children. Your daughter and your son can only marry people that you approve of, the father approves of. We have got our independence. We've declared independence, and now everybody's independent and they're all independently pursuing the money, thinking that happiness is found in the accumulation of wealth. So instead of pursuing holiness, which was the Puritan model, the deists and the Masons and the Enlightenment people overtook the idea that government's there to help people pursue holiness, and now government's there to pursue happiness. So you should be able to love the one you love, marry the one you love. Guy can marry a guy. Girl can marry a girl, because it fits into the Declaration of Independence, which is about the pursuit of happiness. And holiness, forget it. Well, until we overthrow that, until you escape it, until the church protects itself from this, shields itself from this, your children will be conquered. They'll be taken in. You send them off to college, what's going to happen to you? What's going to happen to your daughter? They will be taken down in 90% of the cases. So the fathers are at the blame here. Fathers are at the blame. So this is Peter Helland on the show Israel. The title here is Declaration of Independence. And that declaration goes to independence from God, the wife's independence from her husband, the children's independence from their parents, obviously the slave's independence from its master. And are we doing better? Jesus said, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If this temptation to freedom actually leads you into more sin, that freedom is evil. That freedom is evil. If that freedom you want, like Adam wanted freedom, it brought him into sin. Cain wanted freedom. I'm not my brother's keeper. Yeah, didn't help him. It'd be better to cut your hand off to get to heaven. Better to cut that freedom off and get to heaven if it's causing you to sin. And look what's happening. Okay, so that rounds it up. Till next time, Peter Helland on the show Israel.